Prime Minister, what did you say to Donald Trump?
It's Donald Trump déjà vu. The Prime Minister's agenda turned upside down.
Donald Trump's threats of tariffs could threaten hundreds of thousands of Canadian mortgage-paying jobs.
Where's the plan to put Canada first?
Instead of panicking and falling back on slogans like the Leader of the Opposition, we rolled up our sleeves and we're getting to work.
Late Monday, Trump vowed to implement a 25% blanket tariff on Canadian and Mexican imports starting on January 20th. That's an extra tax applied to any good crossing the border paid for by American companies. The cost typically passed on to consumers, making it more attractive to buy American. And the Canadian economy relies on trading to the U.S. Last year, more than 3/4 of Canadian exports went to our southern neighbor.
This will be devastating to workers on both sides of the border.
It would mean a recession for our province. We can't have that happen.
We cannot start a war, and we have to do everything we can to not have these tariffs.
Trump says the tariff will stay in place until Mexico and Canada crack down on illegal immigration and the flow of toxic drugs across borders.
What I found unfair about the comments is to compare us to Mexico. And I can tell you, Canada is no Mexico.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford says he's insulted by the comparison. Last year, U.S. authorities say they intercepted more than 9,000 kilos of fentanyl coming from Mexico, compared to less than 20 kilos from Canada.
It's like a family member stabbing you right in the heart.
We absolutely share the Americans' concern around the integrity of the border.
Canadian officials say they're working to boost border security.
We have, in recent days, worked with the RCMP and Border Services about continuing to support them in terms of acquiring new technologies, drones, helicopters.
I only care about Canada.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says Trump's threat is unjustified, but agrees the border and the illicit drug trade are real concerns.
We trade more with the U.S. than we do with the rest of the world combined. I will do what is necessary to preserve and protect that relationship above all others.
As the government weighs its next move, they're not ruling out retaliatory tariffs.
Our government will always defend the national interest.
While the federal government is still contemplating how to respond, it has shown a willingness to implement retaliatory tariffs in the past, including during Donald Trump's last term in office.
But Kate, Canada's reaction this time very different than that of Mexico.
Yeah, Justin Trudeau spoke privately with Donald Trump, but the president of Mexico penned a letter she made public signaling they were preparing to retaliate with tariffs of their own. But in terms of reaction, this is still early days, and tomorrow the prime minister is set to have a meeting with the premiers to discuss what comes next.
All right, Kate McKenna in Ottawa. Next, let's head straight to Katie Simpson in Washington. So, Katie, you've been working your sources. What are you hearing tonight?
Well, reality has set in, and the Prime Minister and his inner circle recognize they are in for a very long grind. But right now, I'm told it's all about keeping lines of communication with Trump and his team open, ensuring politicians across Canada are working together to work the phones, work any connections they may have, and organize face-to-face meetings, whatever it requires to try to convince Trump to change course. It's made all the more difficult since Trump hasn't really listed any specific metrics or goals for Canada to meet. His demands are very broad, but it's all part of Trump's new America First movement here in the U.S.
Border wall construction is ramping up in Texas. State officials preparing for what they expect will be a security crackdown when Donald Trump returns to office.
And we're already talking, we're already planning. We're going to put a plan in place and secure this nation at the highest level it's ever seen.
Part of that plan appears to include this tariff threat.
Using my favorite word, tariff.
Trump promised voters he would use tariffs for a wide range of reasons, including to try to force America's neighbors into tougher border policies.
Isn't it refreshing that we've got a candidate that says one thing and then gets into office and actually is going to follow through on the promises they made on the campaign trail?
Tariffs would violate the new North American Free Trade Agreement, the same one Trump negotiated and bragged about for years. Canada and Mexico could fight back through litigation and tribunals, but the process is slow and not even certain.
Let's remember, Donald Trump is always happy to pull the fire alarm.
Trump's threat may also be part of a broader power grab to give the U.S. a stronger position.
It is also possible that he could use these tariffs as additional leverage to possibly renegotiate or look at enforcement around this.
Trump has used tariffs as leverage in the past, hitting Canadian steel and aluminum during those NAFTA negotiations in 2018, sparking a brutal tit-for-tat trade war. Critics are warning inflation and the cost of living crisis could worsen under Trump's plan.
He doesn't appreciate it's American importers who pay the tariff and then American consumers who pay it indirectly when prices are raised on the imported goods. I hope our financial geniuses on Wall Street are taking this seriously because it should be taken seriously.
If there's one thing people have learned from the first Trump presidency, it's that his threats are to be taken seriously. Adrienne.
And Katie, we're just getting some breaking news that Donald Trump has picked his new top trade official.
Yeah, and it's someone who knows Canada really well. His name is Jamieson Greer, and he's been nominated to serve as the new U.S. trade representative. During the previous Trump administration, he was actually the chief of staff to the last U.S. trade representative, Bob Lighthizer. He was heavily involved in the renegotiation of NAFTA. Expect officials in Ottawa to try to lean into his knowledge of Canada and use it any way they can to try to convince the new Trump administration to keep trade flowing.
All right, Katie Simpson in Washington. Now, this tariff threat has Canadian businesses bracing. Peter Armstrong takes a closer look at the potential impact on Canadian industries.
The sheer volume of trade between Canada and the U.S. is staggering. The numbers are almost too big to comprehend. Add up all the oil, all the cars, lumber, steel, and grain. Canadian exports to the U.S. total more than $600 billion a year. But if you zoom in, you'll find individual businesses now bracing. Farmers like Manitoba's Land and Friesen.
We're hauling wheat down into North Dakota here. We have about 150 loads to make. We're about 20 loads into our winter hauling.
He's worried about the proposed tariff, but grain farmers are a pretty unflappable bunch.
I'm feeling optimistic. I think it'll be okay as long as we don't run around with our heads cut off about this and freak out.
Grain exports are a fraction of Canada's oil exports. Canadian oil powers the U.S. economy. The industry is so critical that many just assumed energy products would be exempt. But Trump has reportedly said oil and gas will face the full weight of the tariffs. In such a deeply intertwined economy, that will drive up costs for American consumers.
Of all the allies around the world, nobody is more economically and commercially aligned than Canada and the U.S. That's a strength here.
Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. the last time Trump was president, but a big part of the Canadian response then was showing how U.S. tariffs on Canadian products impacts Americans. After all, a tariff is like a tax. It's paid by American businesses and consumers who import products.
It would be a really substantial hit to both American consumers and American manufacturers.
This trade expert says Americans support the idea of tariffs, but don't necessarily realize the cost.
It may be the need to touch the hot stove, and people, when they get their grocery receipts and see it's a little bit more expensive all of a sudden, well, maybe they'll learn the lesson there.
Now, that expert crunched the numbers and found this kind of sweeping tariff, Adrienne, would be like imposing a $210 billion tax bill on the Americans who consume those imported products.
So just maybe that is the opening into how to combat these tariffs.
It worked last time, right? When you look at the steel and aluminum tariffs, it wasn't so much showing what impact this will have. It was showing that these tariffs would hurt American consumers that really got Canada the exemption that they've been asking for.
Okay, Peter, so you'll be back a little bit later on with what more Canada could do to respond.
Indeed.